sound of her own footsteps felt unfamiliar in the silence of the New York Public Library, as if the marble beneath her feet had grown colder with the changing season. Eleanor Vance, 28, surrounded by books older than her bloodline, had long found solace in the past, in stories of families lost to war, names erased by history, and questions no archive could answer. But nothing in her years of meticulous research had prepared her for the object she held that afternoon: a sapphire locket, aged but intact, its silver frame cool to the touch and engraved with a symbol that refused to belong anywhere. It wasn't just a family heirloom, it was the only thing her mother had ever given her without a story. No origin, no explanation, no memory attached. Just a look. The kind that said, "Ask me nothing," every time Eleanor tried. And so the locket became a silent witness in her drawer, unopened for years, until that October day when the rain touched the library windows like fingertips from another time, and she thought, maybe I don't need her permission to understand who I am. Her fingers moved with the hesitation of someone peeling open a sealed envelope not addressed to them. Inside the locket was no photograph, no name, only the engraved sigil, an intricate spiral crossed by 3 diagonal slashes. It pulsed with the kind of mystery that doesn't scream, but lingers. It didn't match any symbol in her wartime records, not even those linked to resistance networks or prisoner codes. It was, quite simply, out of place, like her. And perhaps that was what frightened her most. Not the symbol, but the realization that she had spent her life building expertise in other people's losses while never asking about her own. She could name every ship that disappeared from the Baltic in 1943, every code used by Polish couriers, every transit route from Krakow to Berlin. But she could not explain the woman who raised her, or why that woman never once spoke of her own childhood. Driven by a hunger she didn't yet dare call longing, Eleanor turned to the one tool she had never used for herself, a civilian DNA test kit. The kind she had seen others use to solve mysteries she thought were too delicate for science. She mailed the kit under her own name, not quite believing she would follow through, and yet knowing deep down that the question was no longer optional. Not after the locket. Not after that glance from her mother that seemed to come from a life before language. She didn't tell anyone. Not her colleagues. Not even the friend who always answered her midnight texts. Because some silences weren't about shame, they were about preservation. About protecting something so fragile that naming it might break it. In the quiet that followed her decision, she placed the locket back in its box. But this time, it did not feel like hiding. It felt like the beginning of a memory she had never owned, and the first step toward a truth she could no longer afford not to meet. The email arrived on a Tuesday, though Eleanor would never remember the day, only the silence that followed. The subject line read, "Your DNA matches are ready." But the words felt like a language she had forgotten how to read. She clicked without expectation, without breath. Her eyes scanning past percentages and genetic codes until they stopped on a name she did not know, but somehow recognized: Lena Petrova. Underneath, in bold clarity, the line that stopped time. Full sibling match, 99.99% shared DNA, Berlin, Germany. It wasn't shock that settled in her bones. It was a stillness that came when the ground beneath one's identity begins to dissolve. Her first instinct was denial, but the numbers were too precise, too undeniable, too close to be coincidence. Her hand hovered over the mouse, as if afraid the next scroll might rewrite everything she believed about who she was. Because if Lena was her sister, then her mother. No. The woman who had raised her had buried an entire life beneath Eleanor's feet without once letting it show. She returned to the top of the page, rereading the ancestry breakdown she had nearly ignored, percentages shaded in muted blues and pale grays. A chart that traced Eastern European roots, stretching deep across the Polish and Ukrainian borders like veins of memory buried beneath a continent she had never touched. Her own bloodline seemed to whisper from cities she had never set foot in. Names her mother had always dismissed as nothing more than distant history, spoken with a shrug, as if the past could be boxed and shelved. But this connection, was no longer distant, no longer abstract, no longer clinical in its cold precision. It pulsed now with something immediate, something intimate, something startlingly real. It was not a statistic to be filed away, not a curiosity for genealogical charts, but a presence that stirred beneath her very skin. It belonged not in a footnote, but in the breath between questions she had never dared ask and answers that had waited far too long to be found. The office around her buzzed faintly with the breath of other researchers, but Eleanor couldn't hear it. Her world had narrowed into pixels and possibilities, colors and codes that now meant everything. She read Lena's name again, tracing the syllables as if they might unlock a door in her memory, as if repetition might breathe familiarity into something long buried. But there was nothing familiar. No echo. No flicker. Only the weight of a shared history she never lived, and a face she could not yet imagine. She opened a blank message. Her fingers hesitated, unsure if reaching out would heal or shatter what had just begun to form. What do you say to a stranger who is your mirror? What do you ask when the very act of asking might unravel someone else's version of the truth? The cursor blinked like a held breath. And finally, she typed, I think we may be sisters. No greeting, no signature, no softening preamble, just that line, half confession, half question, suspended in the digital void, trembling between two lives that had never touched but were now irreversibly fused. She pressed send before she could regret it. Then she sat back, not breathing, not thinking, just listening to the dull hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of something vast and irreversible cracking open inside her. In the stillness that followed, Eleanor understood that what frightened her most wasn't the possibility of having a sister. It was the certainty that her life had been built around a missing piece that always knew its name. Hours passed without movement, the window behind her swallowing light in slow gradients. The day fell into night. Unnoticed, Eleanor sat there, unmoving, her reflection flickering in the black screen of her locked laptop, looking less like a woman of 28 and more like a girl who had waited her whole life for someone to call her by a name she didn't yet know. And somewhere, far across an ocean, there was a woman named Lena who had the same eyes, the same blood, the same unanswered questions, and the same right to wonder what else had been kept from her. When Eleanor showed the results to her mother the next evening, she expected confusion, maybe even denial. But what she received instead was a silence so deep it seemed to collapse the walls of the kitchen. Her mother didn't speak. She didn't blink. She only stared at the name, Lena Petrova, as if it were a ghost she had spent her entire life outrunning. And when she finally did move, it was not to explain, but to fold into herself, a woman unraveling not from panic, but from memory. The outburst, when it came, was not rage, but grief, sharp, clumsy, and uncontained. Her mother denied, then wept, then spoke in fractured fragments, words that had been buried in a different language and now surfaced like wreckage. She wasn't Susan. She had never truly been Susan. Her name was Elizabeth Zalewski, born in Krakow, hidden child of a Jewish family who had sent their daughters in opposite directions when the trains began to come. There had been two of them, Elizabeth and Leah. She had believed Leah to be dead, lost somewhere between the ghettos and the forests, another name swallowed by the unspeakable, and when she arrived in America under a false name, With a forged document and a new birthday, she made a choice not to speak of what had been taken from her, to survive by forgetting, to silence everything, even her own origins, even her own daughter. The story did not spill out. It clawed its way free, as if every word carried with it the dust of a cellar floor, the smoke of a hidden train. She spoke of nights spent under floorboards, of a man who died holding their names on torn paper, of a final whisper in Polish, "Nie zapomnij siostry," "Don't forget your sister." But she did. She had to. Because memory was a luxury the hunted could not afford. Eleanor listened without interruption, her breath shallow, her hands clenched under the table. She saw now that her mother's silence had never been empty. It had been full of unspoken wars. Her childhood was not built on lies, but on barricades, each carefully placed to protect a version of life that could not bear to remember the price it had paid to exist. She looked at Eleanor then, not as the woman who had raised her, but as a child who had unknowingly carried a story too heavy for silence. Her voice trembled when she said, "I thought the war ended. I didn't know it would follow me into my daughter's eyes." And for the first time, Eleanor saw not betrayal in her mother's silence, but a wound still bleeding beneath decades of pretending. She didn't touch her, didn't rush to comfort, didn't search for a single word that might soften the rupture, because there are revelations that must be allowed to breathe before they can be soothed, wounds that require space more than bandages, and in that breath, Eleanor understood that what had been broken between them was not trust, but time itself, sliced by memory and stitched back together with lies meant only to shield. But lies cannot cradle what lives in the blood, and the blood had begun to remember, with a voice, a name, a face once lost, and now returned through the fracture of silence itself. The reply came 3 days later, short, cautious, shaped by restraint rather than emotion. "I've wondered for years," it read. "I did a DNA test last year. I knew something was off. Can we talk?" Eleanor reread it 3 times before she dared to breathe, her hands cold against the keyboard. There was no punctuation after the last sentence, and it felt more like a crack than a door. But still, something had opened, however fragile its frame. The emails that followed were not confessions, not declarations, but fragments, delicate threads woven across time zones and tremors. Lena Petrova wrote like someone who had never been asked to share her history. Each word weighed, each line as if whispered through frost. She spoke of a childhood that always felt borrowed, raised by parents who fed her, clothed her, loved her with duty, but not origin. There was always a distance, she said, something unnameable in the air between dinner and bedtime, a quietness in family photographs that never included her face. She remembered being told she was chosen, adopted, special, different in a way no one fully explained, but that word had edges and echoes. It didn't explain the dreams she had of a woman crying in another language, or the way her skin felt foreign next to her mother's. There were no heirlooms, no stories, no lullabies, older than German, only a girl with a Polish name in a house that refused to explain it. Surrounded by a silence too orchestrated to be accidental. And then came the locket, a small sapphire pendant with no inscription, tucked into a drawer by her adoptive mother, handed over one winter night with the words, "This came with you." There was no explanation, no context, just a shimmer of blue that felt like it remembered more than Lena ever could. She had worn it once, briefly, then hidden it away, because it asked questions she didn't have the courage to voice. Questions that sat too close to the hollow behind her name. Eleanor read all of this in silence, her own locket resting on her palm like a second pulse. She hadn't told Lena about the symbol yet. Hadn't asked if hers carried the same. Some truths required presence, and some stories could never stretch themselves across ocean cables and keyboards without fracturing. So she booked the flight without telling anyone, not her mother, not her colleagues, not even the friend who had once stayed on the phone with her for 3 hours after a panic attack. This wasn't a decision. It was an inevitability, a return that had never been planned, but had always been waiting. The day before departure, Eleanor sat with the locket in her hand and finally saw it not as a relic, but as a question left unanswered by generations. She took a photograph of it and sent it with a message that read simply, "Do you have this too?" The reply came before the hour turned, and with it a photo, the same shape, the same sapphire, but no symbol. Just blank silver, like a twin born without a scar, carrying the same heart but not the same memory. That night, Eleanor packed lightly, only clothes, passport, and the locket. Each item chosen with the reverence one gives to ritual rather than travel. She deleted her itinerary from her phone, wrote down Lena's address on paper, and tucked it inside her coat. She didn't need a map, only memory, or perhaps something older than memory, something written not in language, but in the quiet rhythm of shared breath, of matching blood, of sisters who had lived entire lives inside each other's absence. As the plane left the tarmac, Eleanor closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to remember forward, not to hope, but to meet what had already been waiting. And somewhere across the sky, two pieces of the same name were moving toward each other, not to ask why it took so long, but to become whole again. And neither of them would ever be nameless again. The station in Berlin was colder than Eleanor had expected, not in temperature, but in the way sound seemed to vanish into the stone. People moved around her like shadows without edges, their lives unfolding in languages she couldn't yet understand. But she stood still, holding the strap of her bag like it tethered her to the present, scanning the crowd for a face she had never seen, but already carried inside her. When she saw Lena, there was no hesitation, only a stillness that struck before recognition could become reaction. The resemblance wasn't in the obvious features, but in the quiet they both wore like a second skin. They approached each other without ceremony, without scripted joy, just two women meeting in the middle of a life they didn't choose to share, but had been written into from birth. Their eyes met not like strangers, but like two mirrors finally aligned, reflecting what had been lost and silently remembered. Eleanor reached into her coat and pulled out the locket, her fingers trembling as she revealed the object resting on her open palm. Offered without explanation, but heavy with meaning. Lena nodded, then retrieved her own from under her sweater, the chain thin with age, the pendant cool against her skin. When they held them side by side, the silence between them deepened and thickened with a sense of recognition beyond logic. One locket with a symbol carved like a whisper, one bare, quiet in its emptiness. But when placed, edge to edge, the shape revealed a whole, a single design fractured by separation, now made visible again. They sat in a cafe nearby, not to eat, but to breathe through the weight of things unsaid. Eleanor listened as Lena spoke, not in answers, but in moments, a memory of falling on a gravel road, of the sound of a lullaby in a language she never learned, of a birthday always followed by absence. Eleanor shared her own silences, the way her mother looked away when asked about Poland, the rituals of avoidance that stitched their dinners together with threads of things left untold. It wasn't a conversation, it was an excavation. Each sentence unearthing something older than explanation and heavier than grief. There were no tears, only pauses, breath held between the ending of one silence and the beginning of another. Moments when they both turned toward the window, as if watching time move outside them, unsure how to follow its current. But something had shifted, not repaired, not healed, but shifted like the weight of a suitcase adjusted on a long walk home. Because they understood now, the stories they had grown up with were not wrong, they were incomplete. Half histories written in exile, told by women who had survived not by remembering, but by choosing what to forget. They didn't talk about the future, not yet, not when the past still echoed between each sentence. Instead, they compared hands, shape of fingers, curve of nails, the uncanny symmetry of details separated by a lifetime. They watched how they stirred their tea in the same clockwise motion, as if muscle remembered what blood had never forgotten. They laughed once, quietly. When Lena confessed she had always hated the name Petrova, it never felt like hers, never sat right in her mouth. Eleanor didn't respond with words. She only reached out, touched her sister's hand with a stillness full of meaning, and said, "I think we've both been borrowing names." When they left the cafe, they walked side by side, not touching, not leading, simply moving in the same direction, slowly, as if to test the rhythm of two people learning to share the same shadow. The wind caught their scarves, twisted them together for a moment before letting go into the evening air, and neither of them adjusted the fabric. They let it be, a knot the air had chosen, a gesture too small and too sacred to undo. That evening, in the small flat Lena called hers, they placed the lockets on the table, not with ceremony, but with reverence. Beneath the quiet glow of a single lamp, the lockets touched. Two pieces, one shape, a memory that refused to stay broken. And for the first time, the silence between them felt full, not with absence, but with belonging. Krakow did not welcome them. It remembered them. The city met them not with hospitality, but with recognition, as if the stones beneath their feet had been waiting to echo back the sound of their names. The tram rails hummed with memory, and the buildings leaned with stories still living in their cracks. Eleanor had studied this city in books and archives, but no photograph had ever captured the feeling of walking through streets that seemed to breathe history back into her skin. Lena walked slower than usual, as if each step stirred something too sacred to rush. She paused at intersections with no signs, lingered before doorways she could not name, her hands brushing old walls like they might respond to touch. Her eyes darted to windows above cafes, to iron balconies, to worn plaques on brick facades, as though somewhere in this maze, memory was hiding in plain sight. And though she said nothing, Eleanor knew. Lena wasn't lost. She was listening with her whole body, her breath attuned to the echoes that lived between the cobblestones. They followed no itinerary, letting the city lead them, guided by instinct rather than reason or memory. In the heart of the Kazimierz district, they found a synagogue neither remembered, yet both slowed before its gate with a reverence that felt ancestral. A woman stood nearby, elderly, wrapped in a navy coat too thin for the season. Her presence so still it seemed she belonged to the architecture. She looked at them for a long moment, then at the lockets they wore around their necks, and spoke in Polish, soft but certain, her tone somewhere between question and affirmation. Lena replied, hesitantly at first, then fluently, as if the language had been folded in her tongue all along, waiting to be awakened. Her name was Zofia, and she had lived in that neighborhood since before the war. When Lena explained who they were, Zofia didn't flinch or question. Instead, she nodded slowly and said, "I knew the Zalewski girls, The lockets were a gift from their grandfather. One had the mark of their name. The other was meant to carry it when they were together again. Her voice cracked not from age, but from memory, reclaiming its voice. Then she added, "There is a place that may still keep what hasn't yet been lost." With trembling fingers, she wrote an address on the corner of a paper napkin, faint blue ink, shaky strokes, like directions drawn from another time. Eleanor held it carefully, not as a map, but as a thread too fragile to fold. That evening, they followed it across the Vistula, through a quiet quarter untouched by time, past a chapel half crumbling in ivy, until they reached a rusted gate behind which the world seemed to pause in collective breath. The cellar beneath the chapel was damp and narrow, its walls breathing with age and secrets. Lena went first, flashlight in hand, her breath steady, her movements careful as if afraid to wake what had been sleeping for decades. Beneath a shelf of empty crates, Eleanor found a tin box wrapped in faded cloth, its corners frayed like the edges of an untold story waiting to be heard. Inside, there were letters, dozens, written in a looping hand. Some smudged with time, others untouched, pristine as if waiting. They were dated between 1941 and 1945, signed by a man named Dawid Zalewski. The pages did not shout. They whispered. Lines spoken to no one and to everyone, prayers sewn into paper, instructions for survival. And one line repeated across several. "If one of you lives, bring the other with you." And at the bottom of the final page, written in a thicker ink that bled slightly into the paper's fibers, the message that silenced the room: "Protect the locket. It will lead them home." They didn't speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have only thinned the gravity of that moment. The air between them was full, not with answers, but with a quiet inheritance finally reaching its destination. The letters remained spread across the floor like fallen leaves no wind had dared to scatter. And as they knelt together, Eleanor and Lena understood they hadn't discovered a secret. They had been remembered. She didn't know how to begin it. The letter had no addressee, because to write "Dear Mother" felt too simple for the storm beneath her skin. And to write "Susan" felt like carving distance into something already fractured. In the end, she wrote nothing at the top of the page, just the date, and the silence that followed. Not because there was nothing to say, but because this wasn't a letter meant to arrive. It was a space to let grief unfold without instruction, without reply. "I used to wonder," she began, "if silence meant safety, if the things you never told me were your way of shielding me from the weight you carried. But I've come to believe now that silence is not a shelter. It is a shadow that grows longer with time, until it becomes the shape of life itself. And I have lived too long in the outline of yours, never fully knowing where I ended and you began." She didn't blame her. That was the strange part. Anger had once knocked at the edges of her voice, demanding to be let in. But it never fully entered, because what remained was something heavier. An ache, not for what was done, but for what could never be undone. She imagined her mother as a girl, small and frightened, running through snow that swallowed names before they reached their destination, her feet leaving no mark behind. She imagined the hands that had hidden the letters in the chapel, the lips that never said Leah again. The decades stitched shut with a thread spun from fear. "I wanted you to be more than history," she wrote, "but now I know you never stopped being it. You lived with the past as if it were a heartbeat. Always there, always steady, always unspoken. And I, your daughter, was born into the rhythm of your forgetting, shaped not by what you gave, but by what you could not bring yourself to say." There was no ink heavy enough to carry the feeling of being born from silence, no page wide enough to hold the weight of questions that arrived too late. But she tried anyway. Not to accuse, not to beg, not to resolve, but to mark the place where the wound had begun to close, not with forgiveness, with clarity. "You gave me a locket," she continued, "but not the story behind it. You gave me a name, but not the one that came before. And now, I have found them both, not because you led me, but because something in me refused to stay unnamed, refused to accept that silence could be a legacy." She paused there, letting her hand rest on the edge of the page, her fingers still, her breath shallow, as though the act of writing had taken more from her than it had given. Outside, the wind pressed lightly against the window pane, soft and persistent. The world was quiet. Inside that stillness, she wrote her last line, not as a daughter, not as a historian, but as someone who had stepped beyond the waiting, someone who no longer sought permission to remember. "I don't need to be told anymore," she wrote. "I just needed to know you once tried to remember." She folded the page once, then again, and placed it between the pages of her notebook, not hidden, not displayed, but held, a placeholder, a record, not of resolution, but of returning to herself. And for the first time, she felt no urgency to speak, not because there was nothing left, but because everything essential had already been written, in letters buried in dust, in lockets worn close to the heart, and in footsteps retraced through cities that remembered more than the people who fled them. Sometimes, silence is not what's left behind. It is what remains when everything else is finally understood. There were no declarations, no orchestrated embraces, no grand gestures of reunion, only a kitchen table in New York, its old wood softened by time and tea stains, and 3 women sitting around it as though the silence between them had always held space for one more. The late afternoon light bled across the linoleum floor, and in that stillness, something unspoken settled. Not closure, not finality, but gravity. Susan, or rather, Elizabeth, touched the envelope with a hesitance that betrayed her usual grace, her fingers brushing its edge as if it might vanish under too much certainty. Inside were the letters found in Krakow, the paper aged but not yet surrendered to fragility, the ink still thick with unsent prayers and breathless hope. She unfolded the first page, and as her eyes traced her father's handwriting, her lips parted in recognition, but no sound came to fill the air. Lena sat opposite her, shoulders straight but not rigid, the lines around her mouth softening as if waiting for a kind of truth that did not require explanation. They read in intervals, one page, one breath, one era at a time. No one rushed, no one commented. It was not an act of storytelling, but of witnessing, not a retelling, but a return. The air between them thickened, not with tension, but with the weight of lives realigned. Some sentences were read aloud, their syllables hesitant but whole. Most were not. And that was enough. The quiet was not awkward. It was a language they had all known before words, a grammar of glances, of shared blood, of names once lost and now slowly returned. When Susan reached the final page, her hand shook, not from age, but from recognition, from the sheer weight of a name finding its way back. She did not cry, because she didn't need to. Her voice, when it came, was low and raw and unlike any sound Eleanor had ever heard from her. A sound not made to persuade or to explain, but simply to exist. "Lena," she said, and paused, not because she didn't believe it, but because she finally did. "I didn't save you, but you lived. And that is the greatest thing I never dared to hope for." Lena did not respond with words. She leaned forward, slowly, and placed her hand over the letters, then over her mother's, gently, deliberately, as if to say everything that couldn't be said without uttering a single word, not to claim, not to demand, just to anchor them both to the moment, to the truth that had taken decades to surface. Eleanor watched, her chest aching with something like awe, her fingers tightening around the locket at her throat. The metal no longer cold, but steady. She had spent years studying history, how nations fall, how wars are lost, how identities are rewritten under duress. But none of it had prepared her for the miracle of this scene, not reunion, not redemption, but something quieter, something older, something elemental. It was a recognition of continuity in the midst of fracture, the kind of healing that doesn't erase the scar, but folds it gently into the map of who they now were. They stayed like that for some time, hands overlapping, letters between them, light beginning to fade along the seams of the room. It wasn't the end of a chapter. It wasn't even the beginning of one. It was a space in between, a pause that acknowledged pain without requiring it to justify itself. And in that pause, there was room for memory, for presence, for the strange grace of being seen without having to explain the entire journey. Later, when Eleanor rose to put the kettle on, Lena followed, and Susan remained seated, her eyes still fixed on the pages that had returned her to herself with the gentleness of something long awaited. No one asked what came next. No one planned. They simply allowed the moment to stretch, to breathe, to hold them exactly as they were, without needing to become more. And for the first time, the name Zalewski was no longer a burden of the past. It was a name that belonged to all three of them, carried forward not by lineage, but by choice. The morning after was neither loud nor ceremonious, just quiet, suspended, as if the city outside had agreed to pause a little longer, letting them breathe in a space without demands. The air held the weight of something softened, not erased, and the kitchen still smelled faintly of chamomile and toasted bread, though no one had eaten. The letters remained on the table, stacked but not put away, as if they had become part of the furniture, woven into the grain. Eleanor stood by the window, the locket in her hand no longer a question but a memory made visible. Lena sat nearby, her gaze drifting between the wooden floorboards and the morning light crawling along the baseboards. Neither of them spoke, because they didn't need to. What had been fragmented no longer sought to explain itself, but simply existed as one continuous thread that had found its way back to the beginning. When Susan entered the room, her steps were light, but not uncertain. She did not ask what time it was, nor what needed to be done. She only placed a small ceramic dish on the table, then looked at her daughters, not as pieces of a past she had outrun, but as women who had returned from the silence she once built to survive, and for the first time. Her smile did not carry apology or hesitation, it carried recognition, soft and unwavering. It was Eleanor who reached into her pocket and unfolded the cloth she had kept since Berlin. Inside were the two lockets, no longer worn, but resting, each with its weight, its shape, its memory. She set them on the table between the three of them, then looked at Lena, who simply nodded, her hand already reaching. Together, they lifted each pendant, turned them inward, and pressed them into place with a stillness that felt sacred. There was no click, no audible sign of completion, just a moment of stillness, the kind that happens when something ancient remembers itself. The design, once split, now curved into wholeness. The etched symbol, once incomplete, glowing faintly in the soft light as if warmed by belonging. The room held its breath, not to witness, but to allow, Because this was not reunion or restitution. This was reclamation, and the sapphire, for the first time, no longer carried the burden of being lost. They left it there, in the center of the table, untouched, but not alone. A symbol not of what was broken, but of what had endured through time and forgetting. It did not need to be worn again, because its work was done. What it guarded was no longer missing. That afternoon, Lena walked through the streets of the city she had once feared she'd never belong to. Her footsteps aligned with Eleanor's in an ease that did not need rehearsal or explanation. They visited a small museum Eleanor frequented, a quiet place of forgotten artifacts and mislabeled timelines, where silence was a form of reverence. As they moved through the halls, Lena paused before a glass case filled with nameless heirlooms, buttons, coins, bits of lace, objects stripped of context but not of meaning. She looked at them not with sorrow or loss, but with knowing. "These were never lost," she whispered, her voice more breath than sound. "They were just waiting to be named again." And Eleanor, standing beside her, felt something lift, not a weight, but a veil pulled gently from the space between understanding and presence. For years, she had hunted truth through documents and dates, always believing that understanding came from preservation and proof. But now, she saw that history could live without being written. That sometimes, the act of living was the only archive needed. They returned home before dusk, the city golden with late sunlight, casting long shadows that no longer frightened. At the table, the locket still rested, unbothered, unchanged in form but transformed in meaning. The room was still the same, and the air was still still. But now it carried something else, the shape of belonging that no longer needed to be proven. And in that quiet, the past finally sat down with the present, not to speak, but to stay. Evening came not as an ending, but as a hush, the kind that falls over a room where nothing needs to be said for everything to be understood. The sky turned to ash blue and gold, and the city beyond the window softened its voice, as if retreating into itself to let the smaller stories breathe. Inside, the house was quiet, not out of absence, but presence. Each breath, each glance, a continuation of what had already been made whole. They did not sit in ceremony, nor did they pose for a photograph. The three of them, without planning, found their way to the back porch, Susan with her cardigan drawn around her shoulders, Lena with her hands folded on her lap, and Eleanor leaning slightly forward, her elbows resting on her knees, the rhythm of their stillness echoing something older than habit. The air was cool, but not unkind, and the trees, heavy with the last breath of summer, rustled just enough to remind them that life does not pause for memory. It carries it, gently and without demand. The locket was there, not worn but held, passed between fingers that once searched for origin and now only sought to remember together in the softest way possible. Lena turned it over once, then let it rest in her palm, the weight no longer symbolic of loss, but of what had survived against forgetting. She looked at her mother, then at her sister, and without a word, leaned her head gently onto Elizabeth's shoulder, not as an answer, not as a resolution, but as a rhythm found again. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was something quieter, the choice to stay. Eleanor placed her hand lightly over Lena's, not to complete a gesture, but to share it, to make room for a silence that no longer needed filling. The stillness between them was not empty, it was a vessel. A room that had learned to echo gently instead of loudly. For years, Eleanor had searched through archives and letters for stories like this, believing that to save something, it had to be told. But now she understood that some stories are not saved. They are lived, and their survival is not in the telling, but in the choosing to keep them alive through presence. They remained that way for a long while, not moving, not planning, not preparing for anything to come, because what had returned to them required nothing more than space, and in that quiet, the ache of lineage softened into something less sharp, something almost warm. What had been scattered across generations and geographies had returned, not in full, not in detail, but in essence. And that was enough. The line of memory had not been broken. It had only been waiting. And now it had found them sitting still together. The sun slipped lower, pulling shadows across the porch in slow, deliberate strokes, painting the edges of the day in a kind of gold that did not ask to be kept. Eleanor watched as the last light hit the sapphire, and in that single glint, saw not the past, but the choice to carry it forward without needing to define it. She did not need to write it down, nor to archive it, because the women beside her had already chosen to become part of it, not through blood alone, but through silence endured, truth reclaimed, and love that had outlived forgetting. Nothing needed to be concluded. No last words, no grand gestures, just the echo of 3 heartbeats in sync, and the knowledge that sometimes survival is not about being remembered by the world. It is about refusing to let each other go. And in that refusal, there is history, there is legacy, there is family. They were never lost. They were never forgotten. They were only waiting to be found, together.